Horror's greatest villains don't just kill. They embody our deepest psychological fears made flesh. From childhood trauma to psychotic breaks, these iconic monsters represent mental disorders twisted into their most terrifying forms. And the scariest part, some of their psychological motivations are disturbingly relatable. Number 15. Chucky. Narcissistic rage and body dysmorphia. Brad Dour's Charles Lee Ray represents the psychology of a serial killer whose narcissism becomes so extreme that death itself can't stop his need for control and violence. Chucky's psychology stems from his inability to accept powerlessness, even death. His transfer into a doll's body creates a unique form of body dysmorphia where his adult criminal mind is trapped in a child's toy. What makes his psychology terrifying is how he uses society's trust in children's toys to his advantage. His doll form represents the ultimate psychological camouflage. Who suspects a toy of murder? His obsession with transferring into Andy's body shows how his narcissism can't tolerate being diminished. He'd rather corrupt a child's innocence than accept his reduced circumstances. Number 14. Pinhead. Sado-Masochist philosophy and pain worship. Doug Bradley's Pinhead represents the psychology of someone who's transcended normal human concepts of pleasure and pain, creating a philosophical framework where suffering becomes enlightenment. His psychology operates on the belief that extreme sensation, whether pleasure or pain, is the only way to achieve true understanding of existence. His Cenobite transformation represents the complete abandonment of human emotional limitations. What makes Pinhead's psychology unique is how he genuinely believes he's offering a gift. In his mind, the torture he inflicts is a form of spiritual education that elevates his victims beyond mundane human experience. His calm, articulate demeanor while inflicting horror shows a psychology that's moved beyond human empathy into something coldly transcendent. Number 13. Ghostface. Attention-seeking and media obsession. The various Ghostface killers from the Scream franchise represent the psychology of attention-seeking behavior taken to homicidal extremes, combined with an obsession with media fame and horror movie tropes. Each Ghostface killer's psychology stems from a desperate need for recognition and control. They use horror movie rules as a framework for their killing sprees, turning murder into performance art. What makes their psychology modern and terrifying is how they're motivated by the desire for infamy rather than traditional serial killer psychology. They want to be remembered, studied, and feared. Their phone calls to victims represent psychological torture. They don't just want to kill. They want to terrorize and control their victims' final moments while positioning themselves as the director of their own horror movie. Number 12. Jigsaw. John Kramer. Messianic complex and moral superiority. Tobin Bell's John Kramer represents the psychology of someone whose terminal illness triggers a messianic complex, where he believes he's chosen to help people appreciate life through extreme trauma. Jigsaw's psychology stems from his cancer diagnosis, creating an existential crisis that he resolves by becoming obsessed with the concept of survival and appreciation for life. His elaborate traps aren't just torture devices. They're psychological tests designed to force people to prove their will to live. In his twisted mind, he's not a killer, but a teacher using extreme methods. What makes his psychology terrifying is how he genuinely believes his victims should thank him. His inability to see the trauma he causes shows a complete disconnect from normal human empathy. Number 11. Candyman. Racial trauma and vengeful justice. Tony Todd's Candyman represents the psychology of historical racial trauma manifesting as supernatural vengeance. His origin story shows how lynching and injustice can create a vengeful spirit driven by collective pain. Candyman's psychology operates on the belief that he's dispensing justice for centuries of racial violence and oppression. His killings aren't random. They are targeted responses to disbelief and disrespect. What makes his psychology complex is how he's both victim and victimizer. His transformation from victim of racial violence to supernatural killer shows how trauma can perpetuate cycles of violence. His requirement that people say his name 5 times represents the psychological need for acknowledgement. He can't rest until his story and suffering are recognized and remembered. Number 10. Leatherface. Developmental disability and family dysfunction. Gunnar Hansen's Leatherface represents the psychology of someone with developmental disabilities who's been raised in an environment of extreme violence and dysfunction, creating a killer who doesn't understand the moral implications of his actions. Leatherface's psychology shows how environmental factors can shape someone with cognitive limitations into a weapon. He's not inherently evil. He's following the only behavioral patterns he's ever known. His mask-wearing represents both literal and psychological hiding. He covers his physical deformities while also concealing his humanity behind the faces of his victims. What makes his psychology tragic is how he's simultaneously perpetrator and victim. His family has weaponized his disabilities and loyalty, making him complicit in horrors he may not fully comprehend. Number 9. Pennywise. Predatory psychology and fear manipulation. Bill Skarsgård and Tim Curry's Pennywise represents the psychology of a predator who feeds on fear, using shape-shifting abilities to exploit each victim's specific phobias and traumas. Pennywise's psychology operates on understanding that children's fears are more intense and pure than adult fears. His 27-year cycle represents patient, methodical hunting behavior that prioritizes psychological torture over quick kills. His clown form represents the perversion of childhood joy and safety. He takes something designed to make children happy and transforms it into their worst nightmare. What makes his psychology terrifying is how he studies his victims before attacking, learning their fears and insecurities to maximize psychological damage before feeding. Number 8. Freddy Krueger. Dream invasion and childhood trauma. Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger represents the psychology of a child predator whose death transforms his perversions into supernatural abilities to invade the most private psychological space, dreams. Freddy's psychology stems from his history as a child killer who uses dream invasion to continue his predatory behavior even after death. His burned appearance represents the community's attempt to destroy him. But trauma this deep can't be eliminated by physical death. His ability to manipulate dreams shows sophisticated understanding of psychological vulnerability. He attacks when his victims are most defenseless and isolated. What makes Freddy's psychology particularly disturbing is how he turns sleep, a basic human need, into a source of terror. His victims can't escape him because they can't stop sleeping. This one's genuinely terrifying because it exploits our most basic vulnerability, the need for sleep. How would you handle knowing Freddy was hunting you in your dreams? The comments are going to be nightmare fuel. Number 7. Jason Voorhees. Maternal Attachment and Revenge Psychology. Kane Hodder's Jason Voorhees represents the psychology of someone whose childhood trauma and mental attachment create a killing machine driven by the need to avenge his mother's death and protect Camp Crystal Lake. Jason's psychology is built on arrested development. His mental and emotional growth stopped at the moment of his childhood drowning, leaving him with a child's understanding of right and wrong, but an adult's capacity for violence. His devotion to his mother's memory shows how unhealthy attachment can persist even after death. He's not just killing camp counselors, he's punishing them for the negligence that led to his drowning. What makes Jason's psychology tragic is how his killings are motivated by a child's sense of justice. In his mind, he's protecting other children from experiencing the abandonment and neglect he suffered. Number 6. Michael Myers. Antisocial personality disorder and pure evil. Nick Castle and James Jude Courtney's Michael Myers represents the psychology of someone born without empathy or conscience, the clinical definition of a psychopath taken to its most extreme conclusion. Michael's psychology is terrifying because there's no trauma or trigger that explains his behavior. He kills because that's his nature, making him the embodiment of evil without cause or cure. His obsession with Laurie Strode represents how psychopaths can become fixated on specific individuals, turning stalking into a lifelong compulsion that transcends normal human motivation. What makes Michael's psychology most disturbing is his complete lack of emotional response to violence. He doesn't enjoy killing. He simply does it with the same emotional investment most people have in breathing. Number 5. Hannibal Lecter. Sophisticated psychopathy and cannibalistic compulsion. Anthony Hopkins' Hannibal Lecter represents the psychology of a highly intelligent psychopath whose cannibalism stems from a combination of childhood trauma and an evolved sense of superiority over lesser humans. Lecter's psychology combines genius-level intellect with complete absence of empathy, creating someone who sees other humans as either interesting puzzles or potential meals. His cannibalism isn't just about sustenance. It's about psychological dominance and the ultimate expression of his belief that he's evolved beyond normal human limitations. What makes his psychology terrifying is how he uses his psychiatric training to manipulate others while hiding his true nature behind a facade of cultured sophistication. Number 4. Norman Bates, Dissociative Identity Disorder and Maternal Domination. Anthony Perkins' Norman Bates represents one of cinema's most famous portrayals of dissociative identity disorder, where his mother's psychological abuse creates a split personality that emerges to commit murders. Norman's psychology shows how extreme maternal domination can fracture a developing mind. His mother personality represents all the rage and violence that Norman himself is too gentle to express. His taxidermy hobby represents his attempt to preserve and control life after death, mirroring his psychological preservation of his mother's controlling influence. What makes Norman's psychology tragic is how his genuine kindness and intelligence are overshadowed by the violent personality his trauma created. He's simultaneously victim and perpetrator of his mother's abuse. Number 3. Regan MacNeil, The Demon, Possession, Psychology, and Religious Trauma. Linda Blair's Possessed Regan represents the psychology of demonic possession as a manifestation of religious trauma and the loss of innocence, combined with the terror of losing control over one's own body and mind. The possession psychology operates on the complete inversion of childhood innocence. Everything pure and good about Regan becomes corrupted and weaponized against those who love her. What makes the possession terrifying is how it represents every parent's worst fear, that their child could become something unrecognizable and dangerous beyond their ability to help or control. The demon psychology shows sophisticated understanding of human weakness, using Regan's relationships and the family's faith against them in the most psychologically damaging ways possible. Number 2. Jack Torrance, Isolation, Psychosis, and Domestic Violence. Jack Nicholson's Jack Torrance represents the psychology of someone whose pre-existing violent tendencies and alcoholism are amplified by isolation until they manifest as homicidal rage against his own family. Jack's psychology shows how isolation can trigger psychotic breaks in people who are already psychologically unstable. The Overlook Hotel doesn't make him violent. It removes the social constraints that were keeping his violence in check. His writer's block represents creative frustration that becomes displaced onto his family, showing how narcissistic rage can transform loved ones into scapegoats for personal failures. What makes Jack's psychology terrifying is how recognizable his domestic violence patterns are. The escalating verbal abuse, the isolation tactics, and the eventual explosion into physical violence. This one hits close to home for many people. Jack's psychology reflects real patterns of domestic abuse that many viewers recognize. Do you think the hotel made him evil or just revealed what was already there? The comments are going to be intense. Number 1. Buffalo Bill, Gender Dysphoria and Serial Killing. Ted Levine's Buffalo Bill represents the most psychologically complex horror villain, someone whose gender identity issues become twisted into a compulsion to literally wear women's skin to achieve the feminine identity he craves. Jamie Gumm's psychology stems from severe gender dysphoria, combined with childhood trauma that prevents him from accessing legitimate gender transition resources, leading to his horrific solution of creating a woman suit. His psychology shows how untreated mental health issues and social rejection can transform legitimate psychological needs into monstrous behavior. His desire to be a woman isn't evil, his methods are. What makes Buffalo Bill's psychology most disturbing is how it takes a real psychological condition and twists it into horror, while also showing genuine empathy for his psychological pain. His relationship with his victims shows how he's simultaneously trying to become them and destroy them, representing the ultimate psychological contradiction between self-actualization and self-destruction.